Sponsored by the James Madison Council and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Erin Haynes, editor-at-large at the 19th, and this evening I am thrilled to be with the incomparable Heather McGhee to talk about her amazing book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Heather, welcome to this conversation. I'm so happy to be sharing a screen with you this evening and to talk about what I feel like could not be a more urgent topic.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you to the Library of Congress for inviting us into this conversation.
Absolutely. And also for giving me an excuse to congratulate you on being a National Book Award long lister, which was made official, I think, yesterday?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm kind of in shock and super excited. The list is full of some of the most profound and impactful books that I read this year. So I just feel really honored to be included.
Well, profound and impactful is how I would also describe your book. So you absolutely belong on that list. And I am thrilled that people agree. I want to start by asking you a larger question. The theme of the National Book Festival is Open a Book, Open the World. So I want to ask, how have books opened the world for you?
Mm, how didn't they? I was a book nerd, right? I was sort of hard to believe now because I think I'm pretty officially an extrovert now, but I was a very introverted kid and I always had a book in my hand. I remember being in the back seat of the car at night, coming home, reading from like the street light as it passed, it would sort of scan like a Xerox over the page. I was always really into speculative fiction, sword and sorceress, science fiction, fantasy, all of these worlds that I could go to sort of imagine a different world. And I think that really shaped, the horizon of what I thought was possible as I grew up and became an activist and really still believe in the power of the imagination and the power of books to create empathy, the power of books to open your eyes and make you see things in a different way. And that's what I hoped to do with The Sum of Us. That's why, it wasn't the same as running a think tank, which I used to do, and lobbying and trying to craft legislation. I felt like I wanted to write a book and do for readers what I had experienced so often, which was really be transported.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly your book is a testament to the transformative power of books. I would say, and as somebody who had a librarian as a best friend growing up too, I can certainly relate. So look, let's talk about The Sum of Us because I feel like when you wrote the book, so many things in this country had not yet happened. Although a lot of things that you touch on in the book certainly are on kind of the continuum that I think that you have laid out so well in this story. I think that we've learned by now that we were not a post-racial society after 2016. People like you certainly knew this all along. But I guess to start by talking about kind of what else we missed about what was brewing kind of during and after that election, and if that was something that kind of led, as you alluded to just now, to you wanting to do something substantive like a book to get into some of these issues.
Well, I had spent nearly 20 years helping to build and then running a think tank that was dedicated to advancing policy to address inequality in our economy and our democracy. And Aaron, the tools of the think tank trade are statistical research, white papers, legislative drafting, and testimony in front of Congress, lobbying, trying to basically study problems, craft evidence-based solutions, and then get them in front of policymakers and hope that they'll make the right decision. And for my particular field of the economy, I just kept doing the work, as so many people did, and seeing policymakers make the wrong decision over and over and over again. And by wrong, I mean make decisions that would worsen and exacerbate inequality. And it felt like, the data is just not doing the trick. There's something deeper going on here in our country, some subterranean story that is shaping the way people in power believe we should order the economy. And that story is not about dollars and cents. It's about who's in and who's out, who's on top, who belongs, who deserves, what's right and wrong. And it felt like I needed to do something other than what I'd done before to get my mind around it, and then to tell a story that might be a way for us to bridge those divides and create a better future together. So I quit my job in 2017. I handed over the reins at Demos, and I set out on a journey that would take me across the country multiple times. And really, that was the journey that became The Sum of Us.
Yeah. Yeah. Your book really does so much of what you've done when I have called you to help make me sound smarter as a reporter, which is to focus on the legacy of past harms in a way that doesn't just correct the record, but really, I think, serves as the foundation for a way forward for all of us together. Why is that your approach? And why does that approach matter?
Yeah, so I'm not an historian, and I care much more about the future and the present than I do about the past, right? That is not my sort of inclination. But so many of the most important factors in determining economic success, for example, are determined by the interest either being collected or paid on explicitly racist decisions made often long before we were born, right? Things like wealth, whether or not, depending on what your paycheck is, you have a cushion in the bank, you have home equity to draw on, you have retirement savings. That's wealth. And wealth is where history shows up in your wallet, where the racist history of subsidizing white home ownership, white pensions through collective bargaining that were often exclusionary, racially exclusionary, while the federal government basically barring banks and developers from lending to and selling to Black families for most of the 20th century, means that today a Black college graduate has less household wealth on average than a white high school dropout. Let me say that again. If you are a white high school dropout, you are most likely to have a higher average wealth, home equity, savings in the bank than a Black college graduate. So that's why history matters. And the lies that we have been told about our history and the omissions of our history are why we often see disparities today and substitute stereotypes as the reason, instead of recognizing that structures and public policy created the racial economic divide, and better policy, can get us out of it. And if we do that, it will be great for our overall economy, right? The racial economic divide is costing the US economy over $1 trillion a year in growth that we are not having. All of our best players are not on the field scoring points. So many are sidelined due to debt and discrimination and disadvantage. So The Sum of Us talks about the past, it talks about how we got to the present, and then it says that we can do better together for the future.
Now, what you're talking about, you're laying down facts here, but these are facts that make a lot of people uncomfortable, right? These are facts that really people have a lot of feelings about, especially I feel like in this current context. You talk in the book about the idea of the zero sum paradigm, and how that is a way in which racism has really hurt white people as well in a way that they may not realize. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and explain the zero sum theory to people who don't understand or who haven't heard about what that means, or who haven't read the book.
Well, so this was a really helpful kind of aha moment for me when I came across in my journey a whole body of research that explained that basically there's a worldview, a dominant worldview in United States culture that is a worldview that is held more commonly by white folks than it is by people of color, that sees kind of well-being as a fixed pie, right? So if we get a bigger slice, they must get a smaller one. $1 more in my pocket must mean $1 less in yours. That kind of logic, which basically is created, and I talk about this in the book, by a very old story that was used by the colonial plantation elite, and really in many ways, the current sort of ideological heirs to the colonial plantation elite and the very far right wing, use that zero-sum story to convince the majority of white Americans that they are not on the same team as people who may be economically similarly situated, who are also working for a living, working for a paycheck, and that they should resent and fear the idea, the presence or progress of people of color. And so it's that myth that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense, which helps to explain why it is that we often seem so at odds in society, and why we can't sort of row in the same direction, why we don't have, as I say in the opening of the book, nice things in this country. And by nice things, I'm not talking about self-driving cars, I'm talking about really universal health care and child care and a well-funded school in every neighborhood, why we have this anti-government ethos, which by all measures is really self-sabotaging, and yet there is this anti-government ideology which only really took root in the majority of white Americans' consciousness after the civil rights movement. And that's where I talk about the sort of the zero sum being manifested in its sort of maximal expression being to actually destroy something rather than share it. And that's the story of the drained public pools, the way that racism ended up draining public pools across the country. And that is a metaphor. It actually happened, but it's also a metaphor for what happened to the sort of robust system of public goods that created the greatest middle class the world had ever seen in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And then that sort of social contract fell apart during integration, and when there was a sense that public goods had to be shared with people whom white Americans had been taught were not good, they really began to turn away from the very idea of the public. And we saw things be privatized, we saw more of a market neoliberal ideology come in, and that has drained the pool with a cost for everyone, brought in the inequality era instead of an era of a sort of robust middle class that, of course, ironically, is a source of a great deal of nostalgia on the right.
Yeah, the draining of the pool metaphor was really, that was a moment that was really clarifying for me reading your book, because it really does make so much sense, in terms of explaining and understanding how, racism harms, it can harm the oppressed as well as those who are either oppressing or benefiting from that oppression, right? Before we keep going, I want to just give a couple of cues to the audience here. We are definitely going to leave some time for you to ask questions of our fantastic author. And so you should submit those if you have them. And then also, if you are enjoying this conversation and want to share it on social media, there is a hashtag. It is hashtag NatBookFest. So please use that hashtag to share this conversation. If Heather is dropping as many gems for you as she is for me. I want to talk, because this is all on a continuum, Heather, which is something that you lay out so well. I want to tie what you're talking about to last summer's racial reckoning, which really was so diverse and was sustained. But I want to ask you where you think we are a year later, and how much of the country you think is really still willing to do the work of dismantling institutional inequality.
That's such a big question. I will try to tackle it, Erin. I think that we are absolutely still in the midst of the largest social movement in American history. Consciousness has shifted. A sense of urgency is still there among, the American people. 90% of the Black Lives Matter rallies last summer were in majority white communities. You drive the rural areas of Vermont and New Hampshire, the most common, some of the whitest states in the country, the most common lawn sign for, that's political at all is still Black Lives Matter, right? So I think we are still there. I think that we are dealing with a sclerotic democracy where so much of what people want, whether it's the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan and all of the proposals that I see as things that would refill the pool of public goods for everyone and put an end to the inequality era, nice things for all Americans, get supermajority support and yet are stuck because of gerrymandering, because of a narrowly drawn Senate because of the resistance of one or two senators who should be going along with what their own constituents want to see in the country. And the same is really true for racial justice, right? If you look at the sort of main planks of the criminal justice reform and the police reform that was, absolutely what people were out in the streets for. It was about accountability. It was things like ending qualified immunity for abusive cops like Derek Chauvin, right? And that still gets supermajority support, and yet it has not happened.
Right.
So I think in many ways, what we are seeing is still a desire among the typical American community for a much more just and responsive government, and for people in power to be held accountable for excesses, and whether that's the members of Congress who voted along with the members of the sedition caucus who voted to do what the mob wanted on January 6th, right? People want accountability for them. People want accountability for abusive cops. People want more money to go into public welfare than to criminal justice reform. That is majority support, everything I just mentioned. And yet we are, unfortunately, because of, I think, some of the structures that were created in order to not fully have the most representative democracy, because that was never really the founders' intention, and because of rigging of the system by a very partisan elite that has used every single trick in the book to try to maintain power, we are not seeing the kinds of results coming out of Congress that the American people want.
Well, I mean, Heather, that brings me to another question, because I mean, I have to say it does also seem like we are in the midst of a separate racial reckoning in this country, right? I mean, you brought up the January 6th insurrection. We're seeing what's happening with voter suppression. I mean, we are not operating here with a shared set of facts. How does that kind of work against your idea of people being able to come together and move forward? How encouraged are you that the country is capable of working towards the democracy that you envision in this book if we don't even have that shared set of facts yet?
Yeah, well, we've got about a third of the country that is living in an alternate reality, right? That believes the big lie that the election was stolen, that is enthralled to disinformation that is the most technologically sophisticated and the most well-funded, ever in our history, that is completely blanketing people in certain parts of the country, in certain races and genders and religions, basically mostly white evangelicals, more male than female, blanketing them in alternate facts, right? And that is an existential threat to our democracy, right? I don't want to soft pedal that. I also, though, because we are, I think those of us in the media ecosystem are so addicted to the outrage and to the scandal of the outrageous big lie, of the backlash and the fury and the conflict, I think we do tend to overstate how prevalent that is among the American public, broadly. The backlash is well funded, it's well coordinated. This is a very sort of partisan playbook that is happening right now, for example, with the 11 plus states that have passed these attacks on honest education, these history bans, these laws,
Right.
telling teachers and students that they can't talk about facts from our history that might cause white students to have anguish. Literally, the laws say in many of these states that lessons are inadmissible and can have financial penalties or career penalties for teachers if they could cause guilt or anguish among students based on actions taken by a member of their race in the past. So we're talking about Tennessee, for example, a right-wing activist mother trying to get a teacher fired for teaching a book about Ruby Bridges in an elementary school. Now, Ruby Bridges was 6 years old, and she had the courage and the guts to face down death threats on a daily basis to integrate a Louisiana school in 1960. And yet today, according to these laws, white students are too fragile to be able to even read about a 6 year old's courage. So, this is the state of affairs. It is terrifying. There is a very clear line from Charlottesville to January 6th to these history bans and these attacks on honest education. We know what kind of people ban books. We know what kind of people are terrified of the truth. There's always been that thread in American society, the lost cause that rewrote history so that less than 10% of American high school seniors, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2018, can accurately say that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War, right? We have always been living in a society where a faction has wanted to deny us the truth, has wanted to rob us of our shared history, both the beauty and the struggle and the resilience. And the goal there really is about the same phenomenon that I write about in The Sum of Us. It's to keep us ignorant and divided from one another, keep us pointing fingers at each other instead of holding accountable the people powerful enough to shape the rules that affect our lives. Because if you keep people ignorant and not knowing their history, then then what happens is people flood the zone with stereotypes. And that's what we see is we have this racist animosity that is able to brew when we don't know our history and we don't know that, for example, racist stereotypes are the same as they've been throughout history, right? We don't, the same that justified slavery are still operative today. And people who know their history can spot the lies, but people who don't know their history are just vulnerable to those lies again and again.
Absolutely true. Well, listen, one more question before we throw it out to the audience, and I continue to encourage all of you to submit your questions if you have questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Heather, the work that you're doing really does seem to be in a long tradition of Black women who have been truth tellers, who have tried to really perfect this union and be, the shapers of this democracy and to shine a light and attempt to, help us to get to our better selves as a society and as a country, right? I guess, how do you see yourself as a Black woman in that tradition? Why do you think that it is Black women who are the ones who are either called to this work or just continuously committed to this work? Despite being, the disparities impacting them in such a huge way. How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, Aaron, but I think, I do dedicate the book to my mother, a Black woman who showed me how uh, to live, right? Who showed me what it means to be a person on this planet and what you have to do, right? And that is to heal, and that is to make things better. I mean, that's just what else is there to do, right? It was sort of never another option for me growing up, but to see that we give the gifts that we've been given by the Creator back to this place before we are done. So that's just a long tradition. I would also say that there is a way in which people whose identity puts them on the lower ends of the constructed social hierarchy, we tend to be able to, because of where we have been situated, see the whole system clearly, right? See how it fails and who it fails, and see what would really need to be done to fix it. And that's what intersectionality is all about, the sense that when you have these interconnected and sort of cascading hierarchies, there is a uniqueness about the situation that you are put in. Not that, it's not essential to your being, right? It's not actually about Black girl magic, but it's about your social position to where you see how one size doesn't fit all. How it is that rules can be made that can work for some but not for all. But this is where Angela Glover Blackwell, another Black woman's wonderful phrase, the curb cut effect, I think is so useful to remind us that if you fix a problem for those who have the biggest barriers to opportunity, that often benefits everyone. But if you only fix the problem for people who are the least burdened, you know that won't benefit everyone. So that's the way we need to reorient. And that's the kind of wisdom that people, not just Black women, but, I mean, I have certain privileges that others don't. I am a native born citizen and I am acutely aware of that privilege, right? And so I would say that when we look at a lot of the systems, including the pandemic relief, you need to be asking undocumented essential workers how to make the system work. So that's really kind of the spirit that I bring to the work.
Got you. Well, let's see if we can get to a couple of audience questions here. We have a question from Robert McCoy, who wants to know, how should we dialogue with our children when they see everywhere around them problems with race on the news and everywhere they look? What do we tell them?
Yeah. It's a really compassionate question, and I appreciate it. I'm in the midst right now of adapting the Some of Us for Young Readers, and it is a question that's very much on my heart. I believe that we need to tell young people and remind ourselves stories of overcoming and of triumph. Right now, because there's so much constant information, and because the information economy feeds on conflict and outrage, we don't see the full story of what's going on. And it's really important when we teach history, as well as this current moment, to teach how it has always been people coming together across lines of race who have made all the progress this country has ever seen on issues of race and other issues. And so we can't sort of get too caught up in the us versus them, in the doomsday news, in the sensationalism, and forget that people can change, that in every corner of the country there are people who are doing the right thing and trying to make society better. It's in the telling of those stories, the stories that I devote sort of the last half of the book to, the idea of the solidarity dividend, that I think we need to find hope. And remember, we tell children stories that we want them to replicate in their lives, right? So that, I think, is extremely important.
We've got another one here. This is a twofer from Adam Cade, who wants to know, first, how do you respond to white people who want to be the drivers of a movement when they're also perpetuating inequality by their biases in the system? How can they be better allies without us as people of color coddling them?
Okay. I think that two things. One, I do think that cross-racial organizing is extremely important. I think it's important for us to experience the desired state, right? What we want is a world in which we are together and we find common solutions to our common needs, and we feel that one group's fight is another group's fight and no one fights alone. That's what we want. So let's create that even in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and in our organizations. At the same time, there is a phenomenon in which people who, particularly those who've been sort of awakened in this moment of mass mobilization, haven't done the work, right, on their own programming and the unlearning that they need to do to not perpetuate interpersonal harm and to really know how to do the work better externally. And so for them, I would say, there's an expression like get your cousin, which basically means, do the work in your own community and don't just try to show up and, be where the cool kids are, if that's the way you're thinking about this, but actually do the harder work that may require sort of, it's a tougher conversation. It often will, if you are really organizing your family and your neighborhood or your church, you are going to interact with the same lies and stories and distortions and biases that you probably were programmed with in your own growing up. So that's why it's often very important to start where you are and in your own community as a white ally, before sort of, or not before, but, emphasize that rather than jumping into maybe more sort of morally comfortable places in cross-racial spaces. So it's complicated, but I also think that we also need to give each other some compassion all across the board. The 4 years of the last administration were extraordinarily difficult. This past year, the pandemic, everything is just, there's so much stress that we are all carrying. So I really do think that, you know, we need to all around the table, give each other as much compassion as possible.
Absolutely. And keep going, right? Because this is not easy. We will make mistakes along the way. But yes, having
Yeah.
compassion for others as they continue to remain committed to the process is how we can all move forward together. Well, Heather, do you have a final thought before I let you go? Of course, we could talk about this all day, but unfortunately, we have time flies when you are having such a robust and engaging conversation. What are your final thoughts on this before we have to go?
I would just say to the audience, if you have not spoken up in defense of honest education in your community, please do. Write your elected officials, write your school board, go to a school board meeting. Recognize that people who love books should be outraged by what's going on in the name of attacks on critical race theory. And this is a really important time for people of good conscience not to be silent. That would be my last message to this book-loving audience.
A good note to end on. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much to the Library of Congress. And thanks so much to our audience for your attention and for your thoughtful questions. Have a good evening,
Thank you,
everyone.
Karen.
As they say.